Kristen Kazak. I just wanted to welcome you to our space. In honor of Indigenous Peoples Day on Monday, I do want to start off with a territorial acknowledgement. So in keeping with regional protocol, I just want to start by acknowledging the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and by honoring the sovereignty of the Six Nations, Mohawk, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, Seneca, and Tuscarora, and their land where we are situated and where the majority of this work takes place. In this acknowledgement, we hope to demonstrate respect for the treaties that were made on these territories and remorse for the harms and mistakes of the far and recent past. We pledge to work towards partnership with a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. So, welcome all to this space. We're excited for the conversation today. It's a very unique opportunity, and we really love pairing experts from far away with experts in Buffalo, and we hope to do even more of that in the future. So just a little quick things, some logistics. There are some refreshments and beverages outside. So we're all adults here. Feel free to grab any as you need. If you need the restroom, if you haven't been to this space, if you walk out of this room and you go left, it's halfway down the hall on your right. And there's also water fountains as well. Just a little bit about this space. So this room in our classroom, and we have a downstairs area, is called our Buffalo Commons, which is the joint collaboration between Cornell ILR here in Buffalo and Partnership for the Public Good, which is a community-based think tank, which many of you know of. And my work, the work that I work on with all of my colleagues here, is on the Buffalo Commons, which is the digital library. So if you haven't visited yet, it's on PPG's website and on Cornell ILR's website, where we make lots of resources and research available and accessible to all of our partners and anyone in the area and on Cornell's campus. So highly recommend you visit that. If you or your organization has information that you think should be housed on there, feel free to send it along, and if we're able to, we would love to host it in there, giving proper credit. Another thing that we do is we have a researchers network. So if you're a researcher or if you work with them, we try to pair researchers with any of our community partners to do some sort of Buffalo or Western New York focused research. So if you have burning questions in your organization, you don't have the capacity to pursue them, we try to match you with someone who's able to do that. Or if you're a researcher who really wants to do something that's meaningful and impactful for community partners, let us know, and we'd love to try to find one that matches. The last thing is we host these workshops. We want to make information available to anyone in Buffalo, especially our partners and anyone affiliated with them. So obviously this is the conversation that we're going to have today, a really great one about narratives. But if there's other topics you're interested in or really want a workshop on, we would love to figure out how we can find that information or expertise. So feel free to reach out, let us know. But without further ado, I'm excited to introduce our two speakers, panelists, experts today. And I'll start with Dr. Balu Balasubramaniam. Thank you. He prefers to go by Balu, but I was like, we have to say it correct at least one time because names are really important. Dr. Balu is a development activist, public policy advocate, author, and leadership trainer. He's a physician by qualification, which is crazy because that's what I would be in a hospital if I didn't hate blood. But he's also received several master's degrees, including a master's in public administration from the Harvard Kennedy School. At the age of 19, he founded the Swami Vivekananda Youth Movement, one of India's leading development organizations based on the principles of nonviolence, truth, service, and sacrifice. He spent the last 34 years of his life in the service of rural and tribal poor in the forests of India. The SVYM has partnerships with Cornell ILR Global Service Learning Program and Human Ecology's Global Health Program. So after spending his 26 years in development work, he pursued his academic degrees in leadership, organizational development, and public policy. He was the Frank H.T. Rhodes Scholar Professor at Cornell between 2012 and 2014 and continues to hold academic positions in Cornell and lots of other universities. His books, Voices from the Grassroots and I, the Citizen, are a compilation of narratives and reflections of a development activist and are now globally acclaimed. He's also the founder and chairman of Grassroots Research and Advocacy Movement, GRAM, a public policy think tank. Very appropriate for this conversation. Inspired by the message of the SVYM, he sees his life's mission as building a resurgent India by inspiring leadership in the youth of the country. He's also the recipient of lots of state and national awards. Many international, national, and state committees have counted upon his experience in planning and executing rural development programs. And he's an advisory member of various organizations working in the fields of health and education around the country. The esteemed Sam Magavern, our local expert, he's actually going to be teaching a class. He's a visiting activist scholar at Cornell called Lawyers as Change Agents, Pathways to the Public Good, on Ithaca's campus, and we're hoping to conduct workshops here in Buffalo, so stay tuned. He serves as a senior policy fellow at PPG, where he, as many of you know, co-directed or directed since its founding in 2007 through 2018, sorry. He teaches at SUNY Buffalo Law School and Cornell ILR School. Graduate of Harvard University and UCLA School, he serves as the attorney for the City of Buffalo Living Wage Commission and member of the Niagara River Greenway Commission. His publications range. Many of you may have seen his poetry, but he also has comic books and nonfiction books, a movie, and he also hosts a radio show, helps to host a radio show. Still? Okay, because I was like, Andrea was just there. But is a staunch advocate for the radio show, which is on WUFO and Power 96.5. So without further ado, I'm really excited to introduce these two folks to have this conversation about reshaping narratives, which is something that's very near and dear to my heart, and something that we talked a lot about in our Indigenous network of schools that we worked with. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you. I'm going to go first. My voice is bad, so please pardon me for the... If you can't hear me, just stop me and ask me to repeat something I'm going to say. Thanks for having me here, and it's a pleasure to be here again at Buffalo. Before we get into reshaping narratives, I want to talk about how the narratives got shaped in the first place. And this is going to be my version. Obviously, it's based on a lot of experiential as well as academic work. And I'm going to start writing. I hate PowerPoints. Honestly, I always tell people I love to make powerful points. Hopefully, I'll leave with some powerful points today. My understanding of human development comes from my life's work with indigenous communities in India and seeing the way they have suffered and asking myself very difficult questions of why are they where they are? Who put them there? And why is the state who's supposed to take care? The Indian Constitution sort of guarantees a lot of stuff. Why has it failed the ordinary citizen? And so if the Constitution is in black and white and it's out there, what do the founding fathers really imagine India to be, and where is it going? And so these questions is what my battle started with myself first, then with the state, with all this kind of institutions. So I consider, I don't know how I could, it's very difficult to say what I do, but it's easy to say what I don't like. I think, and it's true in most states, at least in India, in the Indian context, 8% of the population are indigenous tribal communities, and we have given them special status in our constitution, but in real life, that special status doesn't translate as action for those people. So I believe the state is the largest proponent of exploitation of these indigenous communities, and structured violence of the state is very visible in the way they manage these indigenous communities. So a lot of my background of my work comes from those kind of experiences and what the narratives I started seeing and started unpacking in my mind. So you might find me a little biased. You got to tolerate me for that. And I think I have the liberty of being biased for what I've gone through. That's the way I see myself. So I'm going to walk you down a journey, at least the indigenous communities I lived with, though they're part of the so-called market economy of India, they literally lived a life of food gathering, hunting kind of a society before the national parks were declared. And so once the national parks were formed in the 1970s, they had to actually necessarily integrate with mainstream economies. And that's how mainstream society called them poor. I don't see them as poor because in the traditional economies they belonged to, they were quite well off, in my opinion. So we had a new narrative that got fashioned by mainstream economy. So I started getting deeper on how did this happen and why does the state even call them poor? So I'm going to walk you through F1 story. Imagine there are only 4 people in this world. And let's call them F1, F2, F3 and F4. All 4 of them are farmers and they all have an equal piece of land. And they're expected to do whatever little they're supposed to do, and they're graduating from a hunter-gatherer society to an agricultural society. So they have to cultivate, there's no other option for them, they've got to eat their food. If these people were there, I'm going to, by accident of birth, by call it God's divine hand, whatever you can call it, F1 has got a lot of physical strength. He's also very good in agriculture. So he's got 2 resources, 3 resources. He's got the land. Everybody's got equal land, but this guy's got a good knowledge of agriculture and got a lot of physical strength. F2 is also got a lot of physical strength, but not much. I'll call this fellow, I'll give him twice. But his knowledge of agriculture is very good, but his strength is not as much as this guy. Half of what he's got. F3 has got the same strength as this guy, but he's got little knowledge of agriculture. And imagine the world of F4, where he's got no agricultural knowledge, no physical strength. If these 4 live in a society where it's trying to discover, it lives, imagine the society is anarchic, there's no order, and trying to discover order for the sake of peace amongst these 4 people. And if this is a reality, I'm putting it in a very binary manner, but it's much more complex than this, but let's start with the binary first. So I'll repeat it again. This guy's got a lot of strength, a lot of agriculture knowledge. This guy's got a lot of agriculture knowledge, limited strength, limited agriculture knowledge, a lot of physical strength, neither of both. So it's not rocket science. Who do you think is going to have the best harvest of the most produce amongst these 4 people?
F1.
Right, so it doesn't take much. So let's say F1's harvest is going to be 4 plus 4 bushels of grain or whatever, and each bushel will last him 3 months a year. So let's say 5. So it's going to last him a little more than a year, because that's what his strength can give him on that land. Now, who's going to be the next highest?
F2.
Again, it doesn't take too much to find out. He's got enough strength, but he's got enough knowledge of agriculture. So he's going to have, say, 4 bushels of crop, so he can feed himself for the whole year. And the next, F3, so he's just got, let's give him 3. He'll be a little generous. And F4 obviously has got nothing. Now, if this is a real life scenario, after 3/4 of a year, this guy has got no food to eat. And what do you think he's going to do? And imagine the context. It's a society gravitating from anarchy to order, which means anarchy exists. There are no rules framed. People live their own rules, their own lives. And if this were a real situation, he's got more than what he needs. He's got just what he needs. He's got just a little less than what he needs. He's got absolutely nothing of what he needs. So in 3/4 of a year, this guy's food runs out. And what do you think he's going to do? What do you expect him to do? He's got to eat too.
Can I ask F1 for something?
You can ask F1, and we live in a world where F1 is going to be generous and say, hey, my poor man, take it. It's not going to happen. That's an option, but it may not be exercisable.
He's going to negotiate something with F1?
He possibly could negotiate. And what is it that he can negotiate with F1? What has he got that F1 doesn't have, which F1 is going to look for him to give him?
More strength.
Land.
He's already got the same strength as him.
Time, because he's run out of stuff, so he has more time.
Yeah, but in a real life situation, in an anarchic scenario, what do you think F3 is going to realistically do? What has he got which others don't have, which he can use as a resource?
Strength.
And how does he use it?
He's going to work for F1.
You're living in a world which is very organized and orderly.
Sorry.
Gonna bully it.
He's going to take it from F1. He can't, because F1's got equal strength. So what
F4,
does
he's going to approach F4?
F4 has got nothing to give him anyway.
He's going to take from F2.
Cultivate the land there.
One, he could take his land, but it's going to be hard work. What is easier? What is more incentivizing for him?
Take it from F2.
He's going to take it from F2 because F2 can't resist him, right?
Right.
And let's say he takes 1 from F2 and this guy only got this much. But F2 is now going to starve after 3 quarters of the year. And what is he going to do? He's not going to stay quiet every year, losing 1/4 of his grain. So what is he going to realistically possibly do? I know it's a hypothetical scenario, but let's just walk my journey.
Take land from F2 or F4.
He can take land from
Oh, F2. F4.
F4, possibly one option, but he has to work hard and he's going to fully know that this guy is going to come back and take whatever he grows. Is that an incentive for him to do work hard?
No.
So what is the next option you think he's going to exercise? And if you are an F2, how would you think? So let me save some time and answer the question myself.
He's gonna write a best-selling book about agricultural technique.
Agricultural economics, right? And who's going to read it?
F4.
F4. So the one option he's got, which possibly is exercisable, is go to F1 and ask him for help. And if F1 has to help him, what is he going to ask him in return? The chances are F1 might say, yes, I'll help you, but he's not going to help him just like that. So he's going to tell him, well, you lost 1 bushel of grain. If I were to help you, I can protect you. Between the two of us, we have enough strength to make sure this guy doesn't trouble us. We have 3 strengths. So you give me half of this. If he's going to ask him for the whole amount, this guy can say this guy can steal it as well. He's going to possibly say, I'll give you half, so at least 15, half the time he's going to starve, other half time he's got food to eat. So this guy, in return for protection, takes something out of him. Now if you look at society and the evolution from anarchy to order, governments emerged as an attempt to provide order. And order by whom? Order whose definition? And because it's in F1's interest that F3 doesn't go steal from F2. If you were to have many more such units around the world, and if all the F3s got together, they can overshadow this F1. So in my view, in the evolution of governance for state, the state emerged essentially to protect the interests of the elites. Because it was in their interest that there's order in society. Anarchy threatens their existence. So they need order, and if they have to provide protection, there's always something in return. So taxation economy actually emerged by providing a service in return for something. And if you look at it, it's also in the interest of F1 that F4 gets something to eat. If F4 is going to perpetually going to be starved, there is enough evidence now in African countries to show that when there's a tipping point economically below which even autocracies cannot survive. People rebel. So if you look at Arab Spring that happened, or if you look at what happened, a lot of this study I started doing because I was an advisor to the Egyptian government, and the president was living in a perpetual paranoia of another coup happening. So I had to keep reassuring him why a coup cannot happen, as long as there's a basic minimum per capita income of every citizen. If that is happening, people are not going to be interested in a coup. So you can push people to the point where they're up to that level, up to the critical minimum level. You push them below, then that's dangerous. So most dictators have fine-tuned this. So if you look at what happened in Sudan, if you look at what happened in Tanzania, all of them, those tipping points happened when the people got pushed below the line, as recently as last 6 months to 1 year. So F1 has to have a welfare economic thinking, because he has to take care of this guy, throw crumbs at him, throw enough crumbs that he's always above that point, but never gets out of it. He can only take what this guy can give. He can't take more than what he can give. So the taxation limitation has to be to the point where I can tax you enough that you can still pay me, but I can't tax you so much that you start bleeding. So, by default, a lot of these things emerge in society, and we don't even track it back to those times where physical strength matters in an economy where it mattered. Now today's economy is different. So that's what I think maybe Sam will talk. I can relate this example to today's economy, which has moved beyond the space of just physical strength. So my view is, if you look at these the 4 quadrants of human existence, or if you call these people, governance as a product of bringing in order emerged. Because F1 said, I got to protect you, And if I have to protect you, I got to first make a rule that you can't steal. So he tells F3 you can't steal. So the emergence of rules happened first. So you make a rule, and who makes the rule?
F1, the elites.
It's the F1 who make the rules. If you look at history, if you track it down to whatever time you can go back in, it's F1 who set the rules and says stealing is bad, you can steal. But let's say F3 still steals. What do you do with him?
Punishment. Punishment.
Before you go to punishment, what emerges first? You got to enforce your rules, right?
Oh, public example?
Yeah, but you got to enforce your rules. So executive emerged. So the legislative function first emerged. Then to enforce legislation, the executive emerged. And then when the executive came and complained saying that this guy is not following the rules, do something to him, then you have the judiciary to adjudicate and say, yes, you stole, you got to go to prison, and you got to have a mechanism to enforce all that. So it was F1 who had to invest in creating order, which means it's cost money for F1. So if F1 has to retain power, it's expensive. Now we don't look at it now because we don't look at one man, we look at the state. State to ensure order is expensive. You need to have rules, you need to have a mechanism to enforce the rules, you got to have somebody to adjudicate, you got to take care of this entire machinery. And so the way evolution of governance is always centered around the narrative of protection and security for the elites. So it took a long time for this to get so structured into the way governance has emerged. And if you look at democracies, I'll give an example of the US democracy, and my numbers might be wrong in the American scenario, you guys will be better at it. I think there's a 98% chance for a congressman or a senator to get re-elected. I think for a new entrant, it's only 2%. Because you can't get an F4 to stand for elections in this country. You can't even get an F3. In India, you need a lot of money to win an election. Because you actually buy an election, you don't win an election in India. You have that means only the people capable of the F1s or F3s in their employment who can use their power to get the F4s to vote for them. So a lot of different ways in which democracy has emerged, and we have this nice word called democracy without even understanding how it works. The rules get framed by people who have a vested interest in order. And to enforce the rules, I'm sorry, I won't use a pen. You need institutions to deliver on the rules. And whether it's today or whether it is 300 years ago, whether it is monarchy, whatever kind of governance you look at, they create rules, then they create a mechanism, create an institutional mechanism to deliver on the rules. But the people who are making it is what I believe is the F1s of the world, the political leadership. They are the ones who create rules through and enforce the rules through institutions. But then let me ask you a very simple question. Why are you guys even listening to me? What gives me the authority to even be speaking here? Very simple question, right? You guys can simply walk out of the room. Who can stop you? So why do I have the space, even the opportunity to even stand here and speak?
Freedom of speech.
I don't think so. I think you're authorizing me to speak. If you guys walk away, whom am I going to speak to? Right? Essentially, you are the authorizing environment. If the environment doesn't authorize me, I have no authority in this room. And so we've forgotten this piece of the puzzle. We're so focused on this, on Trump and on Elizabeth Warren, and then in my country, Prime Minister Modi or whoever his opponents are. So focused on this and looking at the rules they are framing, looking at the institutions they're deploying to implement their rules. And if we don't authorize the rule, how are they going to enforce it? This is exactly what Mahatma Gandhi did, and we've forgotten history. In 1921, he told the British government, well, you guys are making the rules for me to follow. The rules are made by them to ensure they are in power and they control India. They had an institution called the Viceroy's Institution to deliver on those rules. He said, what if I decide to have a non-cooperation movement? He called it the non-cooperation movement and said, from today, all of us, we Indians, are not going to cooperate with the rules. we are not going to follow any of your rules. We're just going to stop following the rules. The British government did not know what to do with Gandhi. They just did not know how to manage it, because if you break a rule, I throw you to prison, there's a punishment. Now I say it doesn't matter to me because I don't respect your prison, I don't respect any institutions, I'm just going to live a free man. I don't even treat you as my rule maker. Now that's a new complexity brought into the game, and we were 1 week away from getting freedom. The British Parliament was discussing in 1921 giving freedom to India. The only reason India didn't get freedom in 1921, it took us 26 more years, because Mahatma Gandhi was a man of principles. A small incident happened, the whole nation was peacefully, non-violently saying we are not going to follow rules. You can arrest us. How many jails can you fill? We had close to 300 million people at that time. You can't get, even if the whole of England comes as soldiers and policemen, you can't have enough people to arrest us. You can do what you want with us, we're not going to follow your rules. So he started off simplistically saying, I'll make salt, because we couldn't make salt in our country. Salt had to come from England. We couldn't make cloth in our country. India, which taught how to make silk and muslin cloth, had to buy cloth from London. Because that's how the Manchester industry could work. We had to destroy our economy to sustain the British economy. He said, I will stop I'll stop buying all that. I will not follow any of your rules. The British people did not know how to handle it. And the best way he did was he refashioned the authorizing environment. He simply said, we'll not authorize you anymore. Unfortunately, the whole non-violent struggle in India changed because a set of policemen in a small little village in the state of Bihar in India, a big procession walking by, peacefully saying we're not going to follow any rules. The last 3 people walking were brutally beaten up by these 14 policemen. And they screamed in pain, and the whole crowd of 1,000 people looked around and saw these 3 people getting beaten up. In anger, they forgot Gandhi's non-violence. They rushed in. These policemen ran into the police station, locked themselves in, but the crowd burned them alive. So 14 policemen in a village called Chauri Chaura were burnt alive, and the next day Gandhi said, we're calling off the non-cooperation movement. All the leaders of India at that time pleaded with Gandhi, and his famous quote is, they told him, Gandhi, in 1 week we're going to have a freedom. The British Parliament is already discussing, they have to vote for us, that's all. They're going to vote in our favor, they don't know how to manage us. Please hold on for a week. It's after all a nation of millions of people protesting. Only 14 died. 14 is irrelevant. Just millions of people, and why are you bothered about 14 people? And Gandhi's famous quote was, freedom at what cost? Freedom at the cost of violence is no freedom to me at all. And we lost our freedom. It took us 26 more years, 1.5 million people getting killed crossing the border. More expensive freedom for us. But the point I'm trying to make is, learn lessons from Gandhi, who inspires me a lot. You can fashion the authorizing environment. And that's been my life's work. How do you fashion a new narrative? How do you fashion an authorizing environment which put pressure on the political leadership, and democracy gives us a space to create the rules in our favor, to create the institutions which work in our favor. So how do you get the citizens' voice back in the game? And this is what is citizenry all about. How do you get the citizens to engage? How do you empower them? How do you enlighten them? How do you get them to perform, to do exactly this, to refashion the authorizing narratives? So to me, whether it's human development, whether it's human rights, whether it's democracy in action, if we can get this to shift, I think we can shift the narrative of development. I have tried to do it in small micro experiments across India. I've tried to do this in little places in Africa. I tried to do this in Egypt as the advisor to government there, in Thailand, in small little spaces where it's actually worked. The more it works, the more I'm convinced that we have been telling ourselves a narrative that we are powerless. We are just a few people. What can we do? I think Buffalo is a standing example. You have done so much. Maybe you don't know what you're doing because you're so close to the action. And if somebody from far off can see what you've done, I think you can really see the difference. So what you're doing in Buffalo is actually refashioning the authorizing environment. It takes a while for the political leadership to become mature. So I work in 2 spaces. I realize I don't have the time and the lifespan to keep fashioning this. Because in my country, everything is a billion. We have 1.3 billion people. So I don't have the time to fashion 1.3 billion voices. So how do you work with this? How do you work with the political leadership, make them more enlightened, more empowered, more informed, and get them to understand, can I facilitate creating a better authorizing environment? How do you work? I can't do much about this because the parliament does it, But how do you work with democratic institutions? Whether it's the Human Rights Commission, whether it's the Women's Commission, whether it's the Child Rights Commission, different constitutional statutory bodies set up to enforce the rules. Can you work with those bodies and advocate for change? So my focus of work right now is how do you train the leadership to actually exercise leadership and go beyond just thinking like a politician? How do you work with citizens groups and community organizations to refashion this development narrative? And I think we can work, and I want to just stop with one example I give. The economic narrative, the World Bank, if you look at their charter when they started, is to fight poverty. That's all they said. They said, how do you fight poverty? And they never focused on anything else. It was so econometric in its thinking. It was a completely something which I couldn't swallow. It took me 15 years of advocating with World Bank. They wouldn't listen to me. But 4 years ago, they invited me, all the chief economists, Kaushik Basu was there, and all of them together. Kaushik Basu is a faculty at Cornell, he was a chief economist at World Bank. All the economists in the room, it's like walking into a lion's den, and I presented the theory of change, that you're all wrong. Can you really build human and social capital? And I use the word human capital. I don't know, I can't claim I was the first person to use it in World Bank, but at least I was decently allowed to walk back after using that word. And today the World Bank has officially declared Human Capital Index report from last year. So they release a report every fall, and this year's report is yet to come out because the meetings are starting next week, the fall meetings, and they declare a report, what is the extent of human capital that is actually created in every country. So they no longer talk of fighting poverty. Now they shifted the narrative. Last 2 years they say creating prosperity. And so creating prosperity, they say you need to build human capital first, which means we can refashion the authorizing environment to get these institutions to listen to us. It may take time, but I think there is hope. I'm going to stop. I'm going to hand over to Sam too.
All right. Thank you, Balu.
I can take more time than I planned. And we'll have the questions, I'm sure, after Sam's.
Yeah, we'll leave plenty of time for discussion.
Again, pardon my voice, I'm really sorry.
Sorry.
I have, I've never heard the phrase authorizing environment before, but it's immediately very helpful, yeah, in thinking about things. And I like the fact that it makes you think about authority and who has authority, but also makes you think about authorship, who has authorship, who gets to tell the stories. So my little talk for you is called What Does Economic Development Mean? And I have some pictures that go with it that I'll slide through. This is a topic I've been interested in ever since I moved back to Buffalo about 15 years ago. And people are always talking about the economy and how's Buffalo doing, or how well are we doing, how well are we not doing. And so I began studying local economic development efforts, and I was struck by the disparity between what I thought economic development meant and what I read in the newspaper as constituting economic development. So here's, so I got this from Wikipedia, one of my favorite sources. Wikipedia, we're going to talk a lot about the commons today, and Wikipedia is, to me, an amazing example of a commons, a place where information gets shared by many, many people and no one owns it all. So this is what Wikipedia says economic development is: a process by which the economic well-being and quality of life of a nation, region, or local community are improved. That's more or less, I guess, what I thought economic development meant as, you know, a lay person. But when I studied how it got practiced here in Western New York and in New York State, the difference became more and more apparent. And what it seemed from reading the newspaper and studying the different policies and programs was that economic development around here meant government actions to help businesses with tax incentives, loans, grants, other types of assistance in exchange for a promise of jobs or a goal of creating or retaining jobs. And that was done typically at a local or a state level. So a town or a city or the county or the state saying we want just keep or get more jobs here, and to do that, we're going to offer businesses different kinds of incentives. So already that struck me as such a narrow version of what economic development meant, but when I looked at our economic development policies as a region and as a state, that's pretty much what all of them did. There weren't really examples of other things that got called economic development, but did something different than that. And the more I studied it, the more I noticed some other things about kind of how we were defining this. First of all, the way we measured success, there seemed to be only one measure. How many jobs did we create or retain in this municipality? Rarely any inquiry into how good the jobs were, but more broadly, inquiry into this. Was it actually helping our economic well-being and our quality of life? What was the impact on public health of this particular company expanding? What was the impact on the environment? There wasn't a really full cost-benefit analysis of, is this actually helping us? All we were measuring was, are they saying that they'll create or retain jobs, just jobs, period. And then I started looking at individual deals, they're often called deals that the government is doing. And one that struck my attention early was a massive subsidy for HSBC, a big international bank, and it was given by a local economic development authority, the Amherst Industrial Development Authority, and it was for a data center in Amherst, and they got $79 million for, my math isn't so good, so I can't tell you how many jobs they said they were going to create, but it was $6.6 million per job. So what does that mean? About 12 jobs, I guess, at the data center. Data centers, you don't need a lot of people to run a data center. So it was $6.6 million per job. But the other thing that concerned me about it was HSBC at the time was heavily into predatory lending. They had bought the nation's biggest predatory lender countrywide, and so they had de facto become the nation's biggest predatory lender. By predatory lending, I mean very exploitative loans, typically home equity loans to people with moderate or low incomes, often senior citizens, basically suck the equity out of their house by giving them a loan that they couldn't really afford. And there was an epidemic of it, and it led to the Great Recession. But HSBC was one of the big malefactors in that. So I thought, why aren't we looking at how many jobs they're going to create? Would be nice, even under our normal metric. Are they good jobs? But more broadly, is HSBC actually good for our community, or are they hurting us more than they're helping us? After we gave them the $79 million, very soon afterwards, they actually shut their retail business in Western New York. They closed 175 branches, and they actually shut down the data center that we gave them the $79 million for. This is the old the Huntley power plant. For many years, this was the single biggest source of pollution in Western New York, of air pollution. It was also really bad for water because they sucked cool water out of the river and then heated it as they cooled their machinery and then put it back into the river hotter, which is very bad for the water quality for the fish and the plants in the river. But also sucking in that water killed a lot of water life every day. So it was really bad for the water, really bad for the air. It was the biggest source of greenhouse gas emissions in the region. So it was a major problem. And yet we were giving it all kinds of government tax incentives. It only employed about 70 people directly, but it was getting millions and millions of dollars in tax incentives. And so again, I was wondering, why isn't there some more full analysis of what this is actually doing or not doing for us? The more I looked at our economic development programs, the more bad things I saw they were subsidizing. Sprawl being a really big problem here in Western New York, and something that our subsidies were very directly involved in. We were continually offering money to companies to build new facilities far out from the central core, which helped depopulate Buffalo. It made people have to drive more to get to and from work and their homes. It meant a lot more public costs over all that infrastructure, all those roads and sewers and water lines as we push farther and farther out. But it wasn't just that we were watching that happen, we were actually incentivizing it with all this economic development money. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we weren't asking even, are these good jobs? And we're still not in most cases. If you look at the Tesla deal, the state invested $750 million in the Tesla plant in South Buffalo without getting a single commitment from Tesla as to the quality of the jobs. They did get a number of jobs that Tesla said it would produce, but nothing at all about how much they would pay, would the workers have a right to unionize, anything that would go toward the job quality. So we don't do a good job of really measuring the quality of life impacts of our economic development policies. And we tend to measure them at this very localized scale. So we're just trying to see, is Erie County or is the town of Amherst creating or retaining jobs? We're not asking, as a nation, for example, is this actually adding to the number of jobs? So we're maybe competing for companies to locate or stay in our region rather than another region, but is that actually for the greater good, or is it just pitting cities and states against each other in a zero-sum game? We're thinking of economic development often. This is Amazon, so there's Amazon, they're really good at marketing, and so they got the whole country to compete for their new headquarters, got an amazing amount of free publicity, got the cities and regions and states to bid against each other for the headquarters in this, again, zero-sum game. And how as a country did any of that investment make us better? It'd be really hard to make that argument. And was there ever a real serious inquiry into, well, is the Amazon a good thing or a bad thing? Is this the kind of thing we want to give public money to, or would we be better off spending it in other ways? Not much inquiry, because it's just, we want the jobs, we're going to get them in our place, and they're not, instead of in your place. So that's bad enough. That's used to be called smokestack chasing, but now it's not so much about smokestacks, but it's the idea of competing with other localities. But at least that kind of makes sense in terms of your narrow self-interest. So if you care a lot about Buffalo and Erie County, like I do, you could at least say, well, yeah, if Geico is going to go someplace, I would like them to come here because it's good for Buffalo and I like Buffalo. And I care more about Buffalo than I care about Pittsburgh. So if they come here rather than Pittsburgh, at least you can justify it that way. It makes some sense. But actually, very little of our economic development spending is about luring companies to be here. We studied 1 year of IDA deals in Western New York a couple of years ago. So we looked at 71 deals, and only one of them involved an out-of-town company. Others were things like this. Paula's Donuts, really good donuts. You can tell how much he's enjoying his. But not what you might think of as a big economic development engine. And yet the Clarence IDA actually gave Paula's Donuts money to open a donut shop in Clarence. So that wasn't about adding wealth to our region, because there are only so many donuts we can eat in Western New York. It's really just about whose donuts are the people of Clarence going to eat, Paula's or someone else's, or how far do they have to drive from Paula's Donuts. In other words, it doesn't actually grow even the local economic pie. All it does is reslice the pie, or in this case the donut, to favor one company over another. And we've done tons of that kind of economic development over the years. We've subsidized doctors' offices, car dealerships, hotels, retail stores, luxury housing. And if you read an article about it in the newspaper, it will say that in return for our investment, we got X number of jobs. So the car dealership said it was going to hire 20 more people. But we never stopped to ask the question, well, where are those people really coming from? Because we only buy so many cars in Western New York. If we buy more of them from this dealership, we're buying less from another dealership. If this dealership is hiring more people because they're expanding, another dealership has less people. We haven't actually added net jobs to the region. That kind of analysis really isn't done. the last thing that is really hard to ask, even if you want to, but we usually don't, is this incentive really necessary for this development to happen? Will the company not do it unless they get this tax break? Well, of course they're going to tell you that they can only possibly do it if you give them this tax break, but how would you really know? It's almost impossible to know, and there's very little inquiry into it. So you really don't know if you're just giving out gravy, essentially, to somebody for doing something they were going to do already, or whether you're really making something new happen. So all those flaws in how we do economic development, and yet, if you read the Buffalo News, that is what economic development means. And in fact, it's so prevalent that the way the Buffalo News covers business in general is mainly that Jonathan Epstein goes to IDA meetings and other economic development agency meetings and writes articles about who got which subsidies, because that's most of the development that's occurring is getting some level of public support, so he can kind of efficiently cover it by just going to IDA meetings and covering what types of incentives are being given by those and by other agencies. So how did we go from this very broad version of economic development? Why don't our policies tell that story? It's almost as if our policies have been crafted by a small number of big businesses focused on short-term profits rather than on the public good. And I say that somewhat sarcastically because, of course, that's what happened. Large business interests in particular, it's not really small businesses that get to participate in this system. Large businesses have crafted the narrative. That is the story of economic development that they tell, that's what it means. And they've captured not just sort of the agencies that hand out these goodies to them, but they've really captured the whole storytelling apparatus so that we all kind of just assume, oh yeah, that's what economic development means. It means we give money to businesses and they promise to create or retain jobs. So that's sort of the bad news, but at the same time, you look around Buffalo and you see all this good news, and you see a totally different version of economic development happening all over the city that really is about well-being and quality of life. But it's being done mainly by what we call the social sector, which we reported on recently. Kristen was the lead on this report that we put out last month. And we analyzed the social sector, and we found that it's more or less about a third of our economy locally is government and nonprofits. And one thing that they have in common is that they're explicitly dedicated to the public good. That's their job. Whether you're in government or you're in a nonprofit, you're mission driven. You're supposed to be making the quality of life better. You don't have a duty to maximize profits for your owners or your shareholders. You have a duty toward the public good. And that's a lot of our economy, and that of course has been for many, many years. So here was the greatest economic development project in the history of New York State, and one of the greatest in the history of the country was the Erie Canal. So that was a public investment in shared infrastructure that made the economy of the whole state boom, made Buffalo boom. It was something that was too big and complicated for the private sector to take on by itself. So the public sector did it, and it had tremendous impact of creating this efficient way to ship goods across the city. Today's version of the Erie Canal would be something like high-speed internet, something that benefits many, many different people, but that would be hard for one private company to create. All the other investments we make in things like public education, public health, safety net services, those are economic development. Those are investments in our economy and in the quality of life and the well-being of our region. Protecting nature, the natural resources that we all share, the natural commons, is real economic development. And so now I'll just share you, I think I have about 10 or 12 PPG partners who are doing this kind of work locally. So this is Push Buffalo putting solar panels on School 77. And one thing about Push Buffalo's model is that it all starts with the residents who live in the neighborhood saying what they want and what they need. So you start with that. What's the public good as defined by the people most impacted? What's the private market failing to deliver to their neighborhood? And when Push asked the people who lived in that neighborhood, it was affordable housing that they didn't have, it was green and healthy housing, it was jobs for disadvantaged workers, it was green spaces for recreation and gardening. And so Push and its many allies started creating those things. And this is a particularly exciting version because it's the first community-owned solar project in the state for people with low incomes to actually benefit from solar power. So that's a kind of commons, that's a shared resource, very appropriately on the top of an old school, a new commons of an innovative type in the Push Green Development Zone. FB Community Land Trust in the Fruit Belt is another new kinds of commons, and in a way a very old-fashioned kind. The idea that land is the ultimate capital, the ultimate resource, and that a shared approach to the land might be something that serves people better than allowing it to get sold off in little parcels. So the land trust was formed to take advantage of something that was already in the commons. So the city owns over 230 vacant lots in the Fruit Belt neighborhood. So we, the people, already own that land. We don't have to take it back from private owners. We already own it, and so the only question is what should we do with it? And the basic idea of the land trust is, well, some of that land should stay in the community's control, not just in the public's control, but in the control of the people who live right near it and are threatened with displacement by development pressure around the medical campus. And so in a land trust model, the community will always essentially own that land, and people will be able to build houses on it, but their equity gets capped. So when you sell your house, you can profit, but only a certain percent, and that keeps it permanently affordable, and the underlying land stays owned by the land trust. So another new model of a commons. There are about, I think about 280 land trusts around the country, some of them urban, some of them rural. This is the first one in the city of Buffalo. Balu got to visit Massachusetts Avenue project earlier today. Here's another kind of common. So again, this started with some land that was held by the public. So the city owned 13 vacant lots contiguous in near on Massachusetts Avenue, and MAP was able to get control of those and start one of the city's first urban farms, but use that as a hub for thinking about and acting about how do we make our whole food system more just and more sustainable, and how do we give youth an opportunity to learn about healthy food, to learn how to run a business, to participate in their community in a really meaningful way. And there they are doing some farming. Here's the Buffalo River. So this was an amazing example of what's often called the tragedy of the commons, the idea that private actors will despoil a commons in order to make their own enterprise more profitable or more efficient. So factories along the Buffalo River in particular used it as a dumping ground, a common dumping ground for generations, and it became one of the most polluted rivers in the country. I guess no one ever lit a match to it, because you could have, and it would have caught on fire, and we would have had burning river beer here instead of Cleveland. But when Waterkeeper started to fix up that river and got the Army Corps of Engineers involved and got a big federal commitment to it, that common started to get restored. And now it's not just that it's good for the kayakers and for nature, but business is booming everywhere near the river, because now suddenly it's an asset instead of toxic sludge, dump. One other commons that we're super engaged in recently, and we put out a report a couple weeks ago about Buffalo's Outer Harbor. So here's an intriguing commons, because that land, everything you see to the west of Furman Boulevard there, so basically all that green space that you're looking at, used to be underwater. And it got filled in as industry and shipping needed piers and places to do business over the years. And so the NFTA ended up owning a lot of it because they were in the shipping, business. And then as shipping went away, the NFTA still owned it. So here again, we've got this big swath of public land, and the question is what's going to happen to it. And our colleagues at our Outer Harbor, they're trying to keep the Our in the Outer Harbor. So the public, we own that land, and the key is to make sure we don't sell it off to private developers so that just a few lucky people get to live or work there, but that it stays open to all of us. Another really cool Buffalo Commons, the West Side Bazaar. Just announced that they're going to move into 3 times as big a space on Niagara Street because it's so successful. So how could immigrants and refugees start businesses in Buffalo? There was a need for a shared infrastructure, for a commons where they could come together and be part of something that none of them could afford on their own. And the West Side Bazaar has been an amazing example of that. But it's not just that it helps those individual businesses, everyone who goes into there benefits from it. So, I mean, what an amazing resource this is in our city, that we get access to all these different cultures, all these different foods and crafts in this one common space. It's really a perfect example of how a commons doesn't just help the people super directly participating in it, but can also help all the people around it. These are the affordable housing that True Bethel did on West Ferry. This was a toxic dump not that long ago. It was an old smelting factory. Again, it was another version of a tragedy of the commons where a private business was allowed to just abandon a toxic dump and not take responsibility for it. And so it just sat there, and the residents felt that they were being poisoned by the chemicals in that dump, and they were having a hard time of getting anyone to do anything about it. And then True Bethel Church moves in across the street. Pastor Pridgeon becomes the pastor for the church, and suddenly you have an incredibly gifted advocate, organizer, politician across the street, and things start to happen, and it gets declared a Superfund site. And after long, hard work by a lot of people who lived near there or worshiped near there, it became affordable housing instead of a toxic sludge site. This is African Heritage Food Co-op. Another kind of commons is the co-op movement, the idea of nestling common ownership, different kinds of common ownership, kind of within the for-profit capitalist model, and being able to compete successfully with for-profit businesses and yet be cooperatively owned. So whether that's by consumers, as in the case of a food co-op, consumer owning it, or these are the folks at Bread Hive, the city's first worker-owned cooperative business. My favorite chocolate chip cookie, or chocolate salted rye chocolate cookie, the best chocolate cookie in Buffalo. So it's not just that it benefits those worker owners, but it benefits all of us. Just like the West Side Bazaar, we all get to eat the delicious cookies. And my last example is us, the Buffalo Commons, right here. So there's Aaron Bartley leading a workshop on the Commons, and the map he has up there is the city of Buffalo, and he's talking about how what once was a commons of the Seneca Nation was expropriated, mapped up, surveyed by Joseph Ellicott, turned into all these different little parcels of land, but how we now have this amazing opportunity because we the people own 8,000 of those parcels in the city of Buffalo. Most of them are vacant lots, but they're also, of course, city buildings and other things owned by the city, but we own them. So what do we want to do with them? What do we want to do with 8,000 parcels? That's the question Aaron's been posing in in the workshops that he just led. So I want to close by saying, how do we reclaim the story, and how do the kind of leaders that we're looking at, grassroots leaders from around the city, how do they get their version of economic development to be the main one or a more powerful one? How could we make it so that when we talk about economic development, we would be talking about not HSBC Bank, but the African Heritage Food Co-op? How could we measure economic development in a way that would reward those kind of enterprises for working toward the public good? So I will stop there and leave it for questions for Balu and me. More for Balu because you only get him once a year or something. You could get me anytime. So, but thanks to everyone. And what would you like to? Turn it over to you.
Yeah.
Well, trying to connect the dots between your two presentations, could an answer to your question that you just posed be the term that you brought to the World Bank? I'm thinking of human capital. I'm thinking about how a lot of these conversations about economic development, as you explain them, as we read them, they're framed in often we want something that we don't currently have, right? Whether it's tourism dollars or Tesla. We want something to come into our community to benefit us instead of lifting up from within or giving resources to the human capital that exists here. And I'm thinking of it, I'm interpreting it through now the urban highways. And so we have this whole conversation around the Skyway, but there's not as much of a conversation about the Kensington Expressway, and so one explanation that I was just given by a stakeholder in it is, well, that Skyway is so important because it brings so many people in. And that's why it's so important, as opposed to, in saying that's why it has priority right now over the one that's in the heart of the city that's affecting people on a daily basis, that's actually affecting the residents. So is it a recentering of sorts of saying that we have to center economic development on human capital, right?
And Seamus, just for Balu and for everyone else, would you just mind saying just super quickly who you are and what you do?
Oh, pardon me, okay. Seamus Galvin, community organizer with Go Bike Buffalo. So spending a lot of time in transportation and in these highways and trying to figure out what we're going to do with them.
Sort of guessed in your question was around public transportation.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I think take a minute to define human capital, because when I was doing my research, I realized there are some 14 different speciality definitions of human capital. Geographers define it in their own ways, anthropologists define it in their own ways, economists define it in their own ways. I have tried to find something which resonated a lot with me and something which can be used in a very practitioner way. I subscribe to the theory of change that human development is a constant expansion of human capability, right? And sort of extending from the capability approach. To me, human capital is an expansion of capabilities in 4 major domains. I'll specify the domains. One is the physical domain, giving me, the physical person, capability, like good health, good nutrition, which means it includes food security, it includes air pollution, it includes water, it includes sanitation. These are all services which enable me to get human capital in the physical domain. Then it is intellectual domain, essentially an ability to get and understand what is happening around me in the world, the concept of awareness through traditional mechanisms of schooling, or you could have informal mechanisms of providing that intellectual growth. Third is emotional capital. Most of us don't seem to be investing on that, which includes interpersonal and intrapersonal intelligence. So if you're talking of peace, harmony, those are all words which will never have any meaning if you don't help me understand you as a person, right? If I can't have interpersonal emotional intelligence, it's not going to work. I'm never going to respect you. I'm not going to respect another religion. So the challenges they're facing today is because of a collapse of all that. So it's emotional. The last is what I call spiritual. And spiritual in my definition is not religious. I would look at practicing the spirit of self-inquiry. Who am I? Why am I here? Why am I born here? Why am I in Buffalo? Why am I not an African-American child suffering in some little corner place? Or why am I not a tribal in rural India? Why am I doing what am I doing? Whatever John Rawls calls the accident of birth. So an expansion in the domains of physical, intellectual, emotional and spiritual domains, which gives me the agency to lead and sustain life. Now, you need it for a particular purpose. It needs to give me the agency to lead and sustain life. So I need to say it's enough. I have the cell phone, it's working fine. I will not buy another phone till I really need it. Not because Apple releases a new model this year, right? I need a lot of emotional and spiritual capital to say I don't need it. I don't need the second car. I don't need the third shirt or the fourth shoe I want to buy. So which demands a lot of personalized growth of my human capital. That's how I see human capital. It doesn't work in isolation because in the world today, if you want to reshape the authorizing environment, you need to understand power.
Mhm.
And power does not come just by myself and my capital growing. And that's why I brought in the concept of social capital. Social capital, the three major definitions around the world, three major measurements we use to measure social capital. One is reciprocity, one is trust, and third is interdependence. Only if all these three are embedded in communities, you're really looking at that as social capital. Now, what you're creating in Buffalo, and I'm fascinated, I hope to spend a lot more time than what I'm spending nowadays. I'd like to come and visit and see how can, I don't know, is it 100 organizations in partnership for the good?
300.
How can you even sustain 300 organizations consistently over the last 10 or 12 years or whatever years in a federated concept? What drives you? What works? What is creating this interdependence and reciprocity and the trust? I think it's a study by itself. And I don't even know whether you are recognizing how much of a innovative pioneering work you've done already in that space. If you can find an answer to that, it answers a lot of my questions, social capital. So you need that social equity to make things move, and that has economic consequences. So if you don't define it this way, the World Bank, despite all our efforts, is very narrow and inadequate in its definition. But it's work in progress, they're bigger. World Bank defines as limited to just three things. It's a predictive measurement of human capital. It revolves around the education and the health that you might acquire over an 18-year period from the point you're born till the time you're 18 in order to mobilize economic growth. So they go back to the economic scale again. So the whole definition of growing your human capital is not for what Sam spoke about, the quality of life. I was just watching, he was using different words. In my opinion, he was talking my language, right? Shifting the authorizing environment, growing the social capital. The elites are the F1s in my view. They have the HSBCs and Teslas, right? How do you get the social capital of F4? Which means, why are you in this room? In my view, you are a F1, but you're an enlightened F1 worried about the F4. And that's what all of you are in this room. Whether you agree to it or not, you are the privileged F1s of Buffalo. And you are talking about equity for F4. That's how it can work. There is no way the F4 can renegotiate a position in Buffalo if they don't work with the F1s of the state or the F2s in different ways. It is different levels of skills. It's a differential way of expressing the skill sets and the knowledge and all the human capital you have. Now, if you don't have enlightened, I'm an F1. You can't expect me, if I went to Harvard, come on, right? Let's have who goes to Harvard? It's a privileged few from India who come here. And it's privilege. I was a doctor in India. I was privileged because my parents lived in Bangalore, the city of capital Silicon Valley of India, and I was privileged to get a top class education. It's just an accident of birth. I was born in Bangalore. So my parents are F1s, so I was privileged to be born in F1, but I chose to go live with F4s. It is my enlightened self-interest, or whatever you call it. It is my own ego, which I went to live there. But I built a huge social capital for the F4s I worked with. I sued the state, I won my battles. So they worked with my F4, with my social capital. So I believe that essentially the narrative I saw in Sam's presentation was, to me, I got an example, a case study of how human and social capital is bringing about economic change in Buffalo. And it sounds repetitive, I would refashion the entire thing in that way. So you got to understand human capital in a very real deconstructed sense, not in a limited way in which World Bank is currently defining. Maybe it will change it over time.
I'll just add that I like the fact that you moved to an asset-based model, and that's definitely something we and Community Health Worker Network and some other partners have tried to promote over the years, is asset-based community development. And I think a great example would be our waterfront. So the original plan was, just as you were saying, pull in something from outside, get Bass Pro to come here, that'll make us more special. By the way, I was recently in Bridgeport, Connecticut, and they got a big Bass Pro on their waterfront, and it's the most desolate looking wasteland you've ever seen. So we dodged a bullet there.
Yeah.
But it was a silver bullet that we dodged, right? The idea was Bass Pro will solve our problems, so we'll give them $75 million or something in taxpayer money to get them here. And then look at the asset-based model was, well, what's special about Canal Side? History. The Erie Canal ended there. So why don't we build from that existing asset rather than trying to pull in a big box retailer? So to me, that's a perfect example of why asset-based community development actually works as opposed to the current model. Other questions? Or
As a quick
thoughts?
rejoinder, my whole thinking is based on what I call the abundance mindset. And
So, I'm sorry, say what
the-
mindset?
The abundance mindset. We as a group of people always look at what people don't have. Even in this example, I said what they don't have. And all of you stayed focused on that, right? So our solution framework is about giving them the strength, giving them agricultural knowledge. But that's a deficit mindset. I work with communities and say, what do they have? They have land. And they have a life, they have people. So, and if you have numbers, they have social capital. Can I use what they have in abundance, refashion the narrative to focus on abundance rather than deficit, and use it as a leverage. And all of us are F1 in certain places, we're F4s in certain places. If you come to India, you're a F4. You have no idea what India is, right? By coming repeatedly to US, I'm a reasonable F2 or F1 compared to you in the US setting. Culturally, we might be F4 in some setting, F1 in some setting. So we are all having deficits in different spaces. But if you start focusing on the abundance of communities, I think we can refashion the narrative. That's what we want to say.
Yeah.
This is kind of a long shot, and maybe a really big generalization, but do you see any changes happening in public education to acknowledge the four domains a little bit more and accentuate, I think, more resources and human capital other than just the standard education right now?
You're asking me or Sam?
Both, actually.
I'll give an Indian example because I'm not culturally familiar with the education system in the US.
Okay.
So in India, okay, let me give this example, more microwave example. The state I come from is called the state of Karnataka. In that state, we have close to 82,000 public schools. Okay, and we have 94% of our children in that state, in rural parts of Karnataka state, go to public schools. Public schools are free. They get a free midday meal. You get into 8th grade, you get a bicycle. Yeah, there's a lot of things. A girl graduates from public school, you get a laptop after you graduate in 10th standard. There's a lot of incentives offered to go into public school. But who goes to public school? 90% of kids are going to public school belong to the CSTs I spoke about, 30% population, which are all the real bottom F4s. So it's as though the state has created a public school for F4. Now, do you think a state which is run by F1s is going to create an education system which they will send their child to? No, not a single politician sends his child to public school. Not a single bureaucrat in the state sends his child to public school. So why are they going to put money into that system? So that's my focus has been, how do you shift the authorizing environment? Every time a politician comes asking for a vote, I ask people to ask back. I'll vote for you, but do you have the courage to send your child to the school that my child is going to? I make this question for public hospitals, I make this question for public schools. It's going to take time, but we got to ripen the issue, right? We got to ripen it to the point where it actually means the school is going to be as good as where F1 would go. Now that being said, our advocacy work has finally resulted in last year my state announcing what is called the Karnataka State Public Schools, a separate concept where I could convince the minister to put a lot of money and said the metrics of a good school is a school where your child goes to. And the school that F1's child would go, and said, can we create those schools for F4? You don't have money for everybody. Can we create it in every county? In Karnataka, we call it a district. Today we have 30 such schools. It's a beginning. But the narrative is their kids are going to come out like that. I can also give another example. One of my students who took my leadership course at Kennedy School, he's a police officer. He went back, he's an Indian police officer. He came up, one of the children who are Air Force, the SCST kids, who came up the hard way because of affirmative action. In India there's affirmative action, forcing their force into their front quadrant. It doesn't work, 7 years it's not work, but some of them benefit. He benefited, he came to the Kennedy School, he went back, he requested his chief minister, don't post me back as a police officer. I don't want to be the commissioner of police in my district. Give me the entire education system of this place to run. The last 11 years has been running, and the kids in his schools are all only their force. And he's created magic. Now Harvard is studying it as a case study. What did he do? How did he do it? Only because he's an F4, he can relate to an F4 kid and plan for it. So I work a lot with him designing it, making it work. So I believe that is refashioning the narrative, shifting the power equation. It's a hard work, it takes a long time. It's taken him 11 years, it took me 30 years.
Thanks.
But somebody has to put that investment. I'm sorry.
No, that's great. I'll give a short answer that's a little bit of a caricature to compress it, so it's a little oversimplistic, but it's more or less how I feel. I think that the story of public education in this country was captured just the way the story of economic development was captured by the business elite. The business elite at a certain point got worried that the public education system wasn't producing good enough workers, and so it declared a crisis in public education. And it was exactly not the asset model, it was absolutely the deficit model. Something's broken, the kids are broken, the teachers are broken, and the parents are broken, or some combination of the three, and we're going to use business techniques to fix it. Sort of technocratic accountability measures to make everyone do their job better, make the students do their job better with standardized tests, make the teachers do their job better with different accountability measures, and that will produce better outcomes. So I think it was absolutely a deficit model and absolutely captured by business elites. So I think that has been mostly disastrous for public education. It's led to teaching to the test. It's led to cutting out of arts, of recreation, of history and social science and physics, everything but reading and math. So I think big picture, very negative. But I'll give you what I think of as a very positive counterpoint, which is Say Yes in Buffalo, I think is an asset model. It starts with saying, we've got all these stakeholders who care about the success of kids, from the business community, but also the teachers union, the parents, the kids themselves, and we're going to work together, and we're going to work holistically to provide a better environment for college readiness. And they've been smart enough. There's a great article in the last issue of The Nation about a charter school in New Orleans that got all those kids to go to college, and then they all failed out because they weren't actually ready for college. Say Yes, to their credit, has really recognized that, to go back to the idea of human capital, the kids need help even when they're in college, and they need a lot more than just sort of the high school diploma and the college application essay. That there's a lot of development, other kinds of development that has to happen. So to me, that's an asset-based model and a really fine model that gives me hope, despite that prevailing climate that's so different.
Thank you.
Other questions?
I did want to
Yeah.
jump in just
Yes,
on,
please.
particularly, because as you were speaking about the 4 domains, so I promise it's 30 seconds. I used to work with a network of indigenous schools, and we have tools to help students to reflect on the 4 domains that we made available to all the schools throughout the network, but not just, okay, how are you doing in your emotional well-being? How are you doing in your physical well-being? It was particularly guided questions to help different levels of students. So maybe you're a kindergartner and you don't really know what that means or looks like to be emotionally well, but to kindergarten level questions versus 12th grade questions for intellectual capital, thinking about college if that's an option. And so throughout this network, we had those tools both for students and then also for teachers to help guide them through them, and then also for the system itself to create that, because as Sam said, the school system wasn't made for a lot of our indigenous communities, and so the schools that we worked with were framed to push back on the system using the community to say, actually, we want something different in our community, and these are the tools, state, that we're gonna use, because we still have to move within their frameworks of schools and public schooling. But I think there's lots of resources out there that are helpful, that are very, I used to be a teacher, you need turnkey things, so here's something you can give teachers and students and schools so that they can make it happen.
Great.
Got time for one or two more questions? Yeah, please.
So you mentioned something in your presentation about the land trust and the lots being our lots.
Yeah.
So going back to, you have these rules that get made, and you have institutions that enforce those rules, and you have political leadership that are assigning a value to those lots. And if they're our lots, why do we not get to decide what the value of those pieces of property are? How do we change the, is it the authorization environment?
Authorizing environment.
How do we change that so that we get to decide what the value is on those lots?
So one
Or
of
how
the,
do we reclaim those?
one of the things that the Fruit Belt residents did as part of their campaign for the land trust was have events on the lots and kind of lay claim to them in that way, have a barbecue on the city-owned lot, and then put signs on them to claim them in that way. And so I think that this was something that Aaron talked about in his workshop recently, was the idea of really citywide identifying all this publicly owned property and starting to market in different ways to say that it's ours.
So what do you think would happen if Habitat went and just built on one of those lots? Pretty sure that's not gonna happen.
No, but a sign that says future, future Habitat for Humanity house. How about 1,000 signs around the city that say future Habitat for Humanity houses? Or
I got at least 20 of them in my office.
We'll all make more, but that kind of claiming, I think, and starting to tell the story so that when people think about all that land in the city, they don't think it's belongs to some other entity called City Hall, but they think, oh yeah, we, the people, own a heck of a lot of land, and let's do something good with it. Let's not just auction it off for the highest price. I don't know if you've done a lot with sort of reclaiming the land and the narrative around Indigenous people.
Yeah, my argument was different. The context was different. It is not here where my argument was these people lived there for centuries. The state comes in, we get independence only in 1947, and then you come and say in 1972 that the national parks are the states. Then what about the rights of people who lived there for 300 years before that? Who respects that? What law, under what law did you extinguish those rights? So I would like to know those laws. And so I opened up a Pandora's box and said, you have no business to extinguish the rights. Just because you become the state suddenly in 47, how do you even compute what is the value of those rights? So my case was, I don't accept money. What makes you say it's worth 100,000 or 500,000? I want land for land. And I won the battle. So I said, if you can take away forests and say it doesn't belong to people anymore, you give me an alternate forest, well, I'll be very environmentally conscious. So the Supreme Court defined a land having a crown density of more than 0.25, I don't know how they measure it, is considered to be forest land. So I said, wherever there's a crown density of less than 0.25, but still controlled by the forest department, is not technically a forest now. So I'm using your own law, I'll ask for it back. And I got all the land released and reallocated to these people. So that was a different kind of a battle where I didn't have any traditional ownership rights. Because people just lived there. They never really knew what was a government even, right? Their chieftain was the government for them. So I had to fight it in a different language, different slogan. And luckily for me, there were two advantages I had. That's the truth. One was somebody who was my advisor for 25 years, who knew me from a very engaged, knew my battles, ended up as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of India. And on his retirement, he was appointed the chairperson of the National Human Rights Commission. So I had somebody who knew my work, knew everything, and also was the chairperson of the Human Rights Commission. So I could sell the story well to him, and I won the battle. But that opened a lot of windows for others to fight the battle, because it became precedents then. So I didn't use this narrative there. The narrative there was traditional rights. Because traditional rights was undefined, I said I can define it any way I want. The law has not defined it, so I'll define it my way. And you can't protest because you don't have a counter definition to it. It's a different situation.
Any final remarks?
And Ryan, one ahead.
Yeah, I had another somewhat different response. I think, raising the whole issue of creating a community land trust is a way of changing the discussion about where should the authority come from, because I was involved in a campaign in the 90s in Massachusetts in setting one up, and at the time it was illegal according to Massachusetts state law. You couldn't separate the improvements on a piece of land from the land itself. So in that sense, we knew we couldn't create one unless we changed the law, but simply by doing this in conjunction with other communities across the state, we raised the dialogue and had a public education process, and ultimately the legislature did make them legal. And so the workup to actually getting the community land trust was really a way of asserting the notion and getting acceptance of the notion that the community should have a voice in determining what happens to the land. In this case, the whole notion was we're creating value here that we don't want to create so much value that we price the community out of their residents. So this is why we have to have a community land trust for long-term control for affordable housing, so that it'll be affordable 30 years from now, not just now. And so I think the educational process was as important as anything that came out of that.
I was going to say, I don't know if this is oversimplifying the Fruit Belt Land Trust, but is it a matter of organizing and educating to the point that you scare the incumbent into adopting your platform? Like, because there was a change that happened there when the elected officials said, okay.
It took a while for the elected officials to, A, think it was feasible.
Yeah.
Really a possible outcome, and B, get convinced that the residents of that neighborhood really wanted it, and it wasn't some conspiracy cooked up by people outside the neighborhood. But yeah, once we got past those two things, it worked. Well, thanks so much, Balu, for sharing your time and wisdom with us. Really appreciate it.